You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts.
Welcome to my show,
Intelligent
Intrepid
Talk.
radio program, right here on, yes, the Odyssey radio. I'm going to stand up and show you my shirt. I don't wear it quite enough. There is my Odyssey radio shirt. Boom. And that's ODYSY1.com. And you can go on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio and find out all the different outlets where you can hear this program in its audio format. And then you can come on over to my YouTube channel and watch the video simulcast in beautiful color. Not even Technicolor. And boy, that dates me. I remember shows like when I was growing up in the late 60s, the early 70s, the show, television show, The FBI, with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. And it would always say, The FBI in color. So, yes, I was on that cusp in my youth between black and white and color. But you can come on over to the video YouTube simulcast tonight on my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts, and watch this show as it's being broadcast audibly. You can also watch it in vivid color. And join join the chat room there with all the Intrepids. It's local to the channel, I guess. So if you'd like to join in the conversation, meet some of the other people who are regulars to this show, come on over and do it on my YouTube channel. Boom, there we go. All that out of the way. A little fumbling through that, wading through the mists and the mucky mire of introducing the show tonight. Same thing every night. Trying to make that original, it's kind of tough. Now, I want to also tell you that I bring to the table about 40 years of research. Something I don't talk about often, but if you're listening to this show and you're wondering where I'm coming from, what I bring to the table, why on earth should you listen to anything I have to say? Some of it I hope is just for the pure entertainment value. I talk about history, I talk about archaeology, I talk about weird things, metaphysical things. We don't get as much into the paranormal and UFO stuff as I like, or Bigfoot and cryptozoology and things, but those are things we can also talk about on the show and have. And politics I try to skirt and not get into too deeply, if only by mention of current events. And other than that, I like to stay out of it. If you're like me, you've grown tired of every time you open up your social media, there's 300 posts on COVID-19. There's 20 videos stacked up in about 7 different people messaging you privately, tell you, hey, you got to look at this. Look at this one. Hey, did you know this? And it's all stuff you've seen 100 times already. Ranging from COVID to the president to politics to the people running for president to whatever. And it gets tiring. And so I like to do other things on this show, as we all know so well already, unless you're new to the show. So I know I have a lot of people that watch my social media, and we talk about politics on social media, and I say, why don't you come on over to the show and watch the show? And they're like, oh, no, I don't want to watch your politics. Well, you know what? The show isn't about politics. It's about other things. I'm multifaceted, multi-dimensional, you could say, in that I don't just get stuck in a certain rut of politics only, or history only, or this only or that only. So, hope you're enjoying the show. We are now reaching about our 230th episode since we launched last August. And so we're almost a year since we've been doing this show on the Odyssey Radio Network. And, of course, as you know, I also do a show with Rocky Stucci, The Situation Room. That was started 2 hours earlier than this show every weeknight. And so I hope you're enjoying all the shows that we bring to the table. And let's move on, because I don't have anything more to say, introductory-wise. But I want to get into what we left off with last night. We've been talking about Native America and the conquest of the American West. And all the history that we've been taught is sadly it sadly excludes a lot of what actually happened. As they say, history is written by the victors. And so sometimes if you want to get the actual history, you have to go in and see the other side of the story, and then you have to find the truth that lies, I'm sure, in the middle of the blending of all of those. I think what has been fascinating to me in doing this series is seeing the attitude, for lack of a better word, of the United States government. And not just the federal government. I'm not so much talking about Washington, D.C., but all the people that were put in charge in localized governments as we spread west into what has become the United States. And looking at those people and how they wanted to drive out the population that already lived here, that owned the land. And remember, the Native American approach wasn't so much we own this land, we have a deed written in paper, and we'll sell it to you and sign the deed over, or anything like that. This was their land. They were part of the land. Now, people have said it's a myth that Native Americans were this peaceful plains and woodland culture. They warred amongst themselves. They're human beings just like we are. But this was their land. This is where they lived. Their religion, their spirituality kept them more in tune with their surroundings and where they lived. Because they knew if we overhunt the buffalo, guess what? We're going to kill them off. And we won't have them anymore. If we do things that ruin the environment where we live, if we shit and piss in the water we drink out of, what's going to happen to the water we drink out of? And so they had their ways of being at one with their land, and their spirituality was connected to their land. We talked yesterday about Pahasapa, the Black Hills, and where Mount Rushmore sits today. That's on one of the most sacred mountains in their mountains. The center of the earth was what the Plains Indians especially came to believe the Black Hills to be. And so this is where we are now. We're in this Powder River. I kept calling it Powder Creek. It's Powder River. The Powder River invasion. How you have noticed in the first 2 weeks we've been doing this series on Native American, how they've been pushing them westward and then pushed them from the west and squeezed them up the middle and started taking more ground as they were finding gold. White settlers kept coming in. They kept pushing them into smaller and smaller areas. And somebody last night in the chat room asked, well, what about, are you going to talk about the Little Bighorn, or as the Native American called it, the Greasy Grass, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, and all of that. Yeah, we're working up to that. Now, the period of time we're in right at the moment, even though we're going to go back and look at some older things that have happened, a lot of this is pushing these Plains Indians, the Southern Indians, the Woodland Indians are all coalescing out in Wyoming now, the Wyoming, Nebraska, that area. And they're being pushed together. And you're going to find that the events we're talking about even tonight in the 1860s, it's about 10 years later when the Battle of the Little Bighorn takes place. And it's the largest encampment of Native Americans ever, was what they all got pushed into when this battle finally took place at the Little Bighorn. And so you're seeing a progression toward that, even though we may jump around a little bit before we actually get to that. But here we are tonight, the Battle of Powder River. And it's better known as Red Cloud's War. And last night we had them where the Native Americans now have these two companies of soldiers that are at the fort, Fort Connor. And it was renamed eventually Fort Reno. And these were these galvanized Yankees who had escorted Sawyer's wagon trains. Remember a few nights ago we talked about Sawyer's wagon trains that were leading white settlers out to be gold hunters, gold seekers. They had about 80 wagons, and it was Sawyer's troops that the troops that accompanied them are at this fort now. General Connor left these former Confederate soldiers with 6 howitzers to defend the fort, It's actually more of a stockade. And Red Cloud and the other leaders of the Native Americans, of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, and they studied the fort from a distance. And they knew they had enough warriors to storm the stockade, but too many would die under the showers of shot that are hurled by the big howitzers. And that's what they had defending the fort. And they finally agreed upon a fairly crude strategy, but it was one of keeping a constant watch on the fort and its supply trail from Fort Laramie. And they'd hold the soldiers prisoners in siege in their own fort all winter and cut off their supplies from Fort Laramie. So this was a bit of strategizing that they had done. And that's where we left off with this last night, the siege of Fort Cotter. Now, before the winter ended, half of the luckless, galvanized Yankee soldiers were dead, or they were dying of scurvy inside this fort. Malnutrition, pneumonia, and from the boredom of confinement, many slipped away and deserted, and they took their chances with the Indians outside. As for the Indians, all except the small bands of warriors needed to watch the fort moved over to the Black Hills, where plentiful herds of antelope and buffalo kept them fat in their warm lodges for the winter. And through the long winter evenings, the chiefs recounted the events of Star Chief Connor's invasion of the Powder River area. Because the Arapaho had been overconfident and careless. They'd lost a village, and they'd been overconfident, and they lost several lives and part of their rich pony herd. And the other tribes had lost a few lives, but no horses or lodges. And they'd captured many horses and mules carrying U.S. brands, and they had taken many carbines, saddles, and other equipment from the soldiers, and above all, they'd gained a new confidence in their ability to drive the blue-coat soldiers from their country. So they were gaining some confidence now. And now they had their fort under siege, their stockade. "If white men come into my country again, I will punish them again," Red Cloud said. But he knew that unless he would somehow could obtain many new guns like the ones they'd captured from the soldiers and plenty of ammunition for the guns, the Indians could not go on punishing the soldiers forever. They would constantly be replenished. Now we're up into 1866, while this siege is going on. In March 27th of 1866, President Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination, vetoes the Civil Rights Bill. On April 1st, Congress overrides the president's veto of the Civil Rights Bill and gives equal rights to all persons born in the United States, except for Indians. President empowered to use army to enforce the law. On June 13th, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving Negroes the right of citizenship, is forwarded to states for ratification. On July 21st, several hundred die in the London cholera epidemic overseas in Europe. July 30th, race riots are taking place in New York. By the way, if you've ever watched Gangs of New York, that's this particular time period. And July 30th, race riots in New Orleans. Werner von Siemens invents the dynamo. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and Whittier's Snowbound are both published, those classic books. In 1867, February 9th, Nebraska admitted to the Union as the 37th state. February 17th, the first ship passes through the Suez Canal over north of Egypt and the Sinai. March 12th, the last French troops leave Mexico. March 30th, the U.S. purchases Alaska from Russia for $7,200,000. Well, you could buy a couple of nice houses on Lake Minnetonka in Minneapolis for that today. May 20th in London, John Stuart Mill's bill to permit women to vote is rejected by Parliament. And June 19th, Mexicans execute Emperor Maximilian. July 1st, Dominion of Canada is established. October 27th, Garibaldi marches on Rome. November 25th, Congressional Committee resolves that President Johnson be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. Alfred Nobel invents the dynamite. Christopher L. Scholz constructs the first practical typewriter. Johann Strauss composes The Blue Danube. And Karl Marx publishes the first part of Das Kapital. So this is what was going on in the world at this time. And now we're back in Wyoming, what is to become Wyoming, and the Dakota Territory. And Spotted Tail of the Brule Sioux, Sinte Galeshka, was his almost the way you pronounced his name. He said this. He said, this war, now he's talking about Powder River and Red Cloud's War, which we're going to hit tonight. He said, this war did not spring up here in our land. This war was brought upon us by the children of the Great Father, who came to take our land from us without price, and who in our land do a great many evil things. The Great Father and his children are to blame for this trouble. It's been our wish to live here in our country peaceably and do such things as may be for the welfare and good of our people. Listen how these leaders speak. They speak the same way. They might not be as sophisticated. They might not be university educated, but they said the same thing. They believed the same things. He says, the Great Father has filled this land with their soldiers who think only of our death. Some of our people who have gone from here in order that they may have a change, and others who've gone north to hunt, have been attacked by the soldiers from this direction. And when they have gone north, they've been attacked by soldiers from the other side. And now when they're willing to come back, the soldiers stand between them to keep them from coming home. It seems to me there's a better way than this. When people come to trouble, it is better for both parties to come together without arms and talk it over and find some peaceful way to settle it. That was Spotted Tail of the Brule Sioux. Now, in late summer and autumn of 1865, while the Indians in the Powder River country were demonstrating their military power, a United States Treaty Commission was traveling along the upper Missouri River. And at every Sioux village near the river, the commissioners stopped to parley with whatever leaders they could find and would talk to them. And Newton Edmunds, recently appointed the governor of the territory of Dakota, and this is still a territory, they're not states yet, the Dakotas, he was the prime mover on this commission. And another member was long trader Henry Sibley. We've heard of him before, haven't we? Henry Sibley of Minnesota. He's the general that marched down to stop in 1862 the Dakota War taking place in Minnesota, just a few years earlier. Little Crow and the others. And so Henry Sibley, who 3 years earlier had driven the Santee Sioux from the state of Minnesota, was amongst them. Edmunds and Sibley handed out blankets, molasses, crackers, and other presents to the Indians they visited, and had no difficulty in persuading their hosts to sign new treaties. They also sent runners into the Black Hills and Powder River country, inviting the warrior chiefs to come in and sign. But the chiefs were too busy fighting General Connor's invaders, and none of them responded from the Powder River area. So in the spring of that year, the white man's Civil War had been brought to an end. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. And the trickle of white emigration to the West was showing signs of now increasing from a trickle to a flood. The floodgates of white trespassing was taking place. And what the treaty commissioners wanted was the right of passageway for trails, roads, and eventually railroads to cross the Indian country. Before autumn ended, the commissioners completed 9 treaties with the Sioux, including the Brule, the Hunkpapa, the Oglalas, and the Minneconjous, and most of whose warrior chiefs were nowhere near the villages on the Missouri. So the government authorities in Washington hailed the treaties as the end of Indian hostilities. And at last the Plains Indians were pacified, and they said, Never again would there be a need for expensive campaigns such as Connor's Powder River expedition, which had been organized to kill Indians at an expense of more than $1 million apiece, while hundreds of our soldiers had lost their lives. Many of our border settlers been butchered and much property destroyed. That was a quote, by the way. And this is from the U.S. Congress, the 40th Congress, in the second session. The House Executive Document. That's where that quote came from. It was at an expense of more than $1 million apiece, while hundreds of our soldiers lost their lives, many of our border settlers have been butchered, and much property was destroyed. Now, Governor Edmunds and the other commission members knew very well that the treaties were meaningless because not one warrior chief had signed them. And they were signing in little villages along the way. They weren't bothering to get the leaders of the people. It wasn't even a bother. They were asking them to come in, but they refused to come in. They were doing other things. They were besieging the Fort Connor. They were protecting their lands. They were hunting. But they'd get these pieces of paper signed by these villages and said, well, that's it. And although the commissioners forwarded copies to Washington to be ratified by Congress, these treaties, they continued their efforts to persuade Red Cloud and the other Powder River chiefs, to meet with them at any convenient location for further treaty signages. And as the Bozeman Trail was the most important route out of Fort Laramie to Montana, military officials at the fort were under this very heavy pressure to coax Red Cloud to come in. And where have you heard that phrase, that they're trying to get them to come in? And other war leaders to cease their blockade of the road and to come to Fort Laramie at the earliest possible date. Now, Colonel Henry Maynander, M-A-Y-N-A-D-I-E-R, Maynadir, I think that's how you pronounce it. Colonel Henry Maynadir, who had been assigned to Fort Laramie as commander of one of the galvanized Yankee regiments, he attempted to employ a trustworthy frontiersman such as Blanket Jim Bridger or Medicine Calf Beckworth to act as this intermediary with Red Cloud. He wanted somebody that the Indians were familiar with to be able to parley with them and get them to come in and sign these treaties. They didn't want to negotiate treaties. They wanted them to sign treaties. There's a difference there. Like if you're buying a house and somebody says, I just need you to sign the contract. And you go, no, wait. I want to have the cabinets replaced and the roof replaced before I sign at this price. You want to negotiate the terms a little bit. They just wanted them to sign it. And but no one was willing to go to the Powder River country. Imagine that. And so soon after Connor had aroused the tribes to anger with his invasion, nobody wanted to go out there anymore. This was hostile Indian territory to them. And at last, Maynadir decided to employ as messengers five Sioux, who spent much of their time around the fort. Their names were Big Mouth, Big Ribs, Eaglefoot, Whirlwind, and Little Crow. Now referred to contemptuously as Laramie loafers, these trader Indians, trader, D-E-R, not treacherous, not traitor, but these trader Indians were actually very shrewd entrepreneurs. They would be like your casino owners today. So if a white man wanted a first-rate buffalo robe at a bargain, or if an Indian up on Tongue River wanted supplies from the fort commissary, the Laramie loafers arranged exchanges, and they'd play an important role as munitions suppliers to the Indians during the upcoming Red Cloud's War. And we got to stop there for this first segment. We'll be back after this break. Sit tight.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, welcome back to the program. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, come on over to my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts, and join the I keep wanting to say local tonight, though. Join the local chat room. Well, it's the only chat room connected with my show. So come on over to my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the chat room. Meet the other Intrep heads. Join in on the conversation regarding tonight's show and other things that they like to talk about over there. Let's jump right back into this. We were kind of hitting on this great... I almost see them as a bit comical, shrewd and comical. This little group of Indians called the Laramie Loafers, comprised of these 5 Native Americans, these 5 Sioux, named Big Mouth, Big Ribs, Eaglefoot, Whirlwind, and Little Crow. And they had this contemptuous name of being the Laramie Loafers, but they were shrewd entrepreneurs. They were the guys that would supply things to the Indians up on the Tongue River. They'd get supplies from the Fort Commissary. And the Laramie Loafers arranged all these exchanges, and they would play a very important role in supplying munitions for Red Cloud's war. Now, Big Mouth and his party were out for 2 months. They were spreading the news that fine presents awaited all the warrior chiefs if they would come into Fort Laramie and sign new treaties. New treaties. What happened to the old treaties? Well, they were tearing them down. And on January 16th, 1866, the messengers returned in company with 2 destitute bands of Brûlés led by Standing Elk and Swift Bear. And Standing Elk said that his people had lost many ponies in a blizzard, and that game was scarce over on the Republican River. And Spotted Trail, the head man of the Brûlés, would come in as soon as his daughter was able to travel. She was ill. Of the coughing sickness, like tuberculosis, something like that. Perhaps pneumonia. So Standing Elk and Swift Bear, they were eager to sign the treaty and to receive clothing and provisions for their people. That's how they induced them to sign these pieces of paper and sign away things. They needed help. They needed supplies. They'd been moved off their land. You know how this has all evolved to get to this place. But what about Red Cloud? Colonel Maynadier wanted to know. Where was Red Cloud? Man afraid of his horses. Dull Knife, the leaders who fought Connor's soldiers. They need to come in. Big Mouth and the other Laramie Loafers assured him that the warrior chiefs would be there. Short time, just settle down. They'll be here. And they couldn't be hurried, especially in the moon of the strong cold. So you're talking dead of winter. So weeks passed, and then early in March, as spring's coming. Now, by the way, March, like in Minnesota, you think of March as being, spring, in like a lion, out like a lamb. And then April showers bring May flowers and all of that. So March is spring. But sometimes in this territory, in the Dakotas, into Minnesota, and Wisconsin, our weather all comes from the Dakotas, from the west. Wyoming, Montana, Dakotas, into Minnesota. And March can be a pretty snowy month. It can be a pretty nasty month. But spring is coming, and they know it. So in March, a messenger arrived from Spotted Tail informing Colonel Maynadier that the Brule chief was coming in to discuss the treaty. Now, and I love the timing back then. No schedules. I got to catch a flight anywhere. We'll be in after winter. So he sends word, and Spotted Tail's daughter, Fleetfoot, was very ill, and he hoped the soldiers' doctors could make her well again. And so a few days later, when Maynadier heard that Fleetfoot had died en route, he rode out with a company of soldiers and an ambulance to meet the morning procession of Brule-Sioux. And it was a cold, sleety day. The Wyoming landscape was bleak and streams locked in ice, brown hills patched with snow. The dead girl had been wrapped in a deerskin, tightly thonged and cressoted with smoke. And this crude pall was suspended between her favorite ponies, a pair of white Mustangs. Now Fleetfoot's body was transferred to the ambulance, her white ponies fastened behind, and the procession continued toward Fort Laramie. So this is a gracious thing that Maynadier did. Now there was a plot behind it, and a plan, of course. They wanted these guys to sign the treaty. But he sent an ambulance out when he heard that Spotted Elk's daughter had died en route, and he sent the ambulance to help and to escort them back in. And Fleetfoot's body was transferred to the ambulance. Her white ponies were fastened behind, and the procession continued toward Fort Laramie. And when Spotted Tail's party reached the fort, Spotted Tail, not Spotted Elk, I said earlier. Spotted Tail's party reached the fort. Colonel Maynard turned the entire garrison out to honor the grieving Indians. Now, this was actually a very magnanimous thing of him to do. But remember, they're coming out of the mandate to kill the Indians. Now they're trying to get them to sign something. And they're treating them very magnanimously. But I think that this was a heartfelt gesture on the part of Maynadier. And so they brought the whole garrison out to honor the grieving Indians. The colonel invited Spotted Tail into his headquarters. He offered sympathy for the loss of his daughter. And the chief said that in the days when the white men and the Indians were at peace, he had brought his daughter to Fort Laramie many times, and that she loved the fort, and he'd like to have her burial scaffold mounted in the post cemetery. Colonel Maynadier immediately granted permission for this. He was surprised to see tears well up in Spotted Tail's eyes. He didn't know that an Indian could even weep. Somewhat awkwardly, the colonel changed the subject. The Great Father in Washington was sending out a new peace commission in the spring, and he hoped that Spotted Tail could stay near the fort until the commissioners arrived, and there was a great urgency to make the Bozeman Road safe for travel. He changed the subject of this. This is the way these people thought back then. He sees this Indian chief cry over his dead daughter, the loss of his daughter, and the good memories from Fort Laramie when the days were good and they were living in peace together. And he was surprised. Maynadier, it took him by surprise. He said to Spotted Tail, he said, "I'm informed that the travel next spring will be very great to the mines of Idaho and Montana." "We think we have been much wronged," Spotted Tail replied to him. "We're entitled to compensation for the damage and the distress caused by making so many roads through our country and driving off and destroying the buffalo and the game. My heart is very sad, and I can't talk on business very well right now," he said to Maynadier. He says, "I'll wait and see the counselors that the Great Father's going to send." So he says, I'm in grieving right now. I can't talk about this. We've been wronged. You guys have wronged us. We want compensation for this. But my heart's sad. I can't talk about this right now. And so the next day, Maynadier arranged a military funeral for Fleetfoot. Just before the sun set, a procession marched to the post cemetery behind the red-blanketed coffin, which was mounted on an artillery caisson. And after the custom of the brûlée, the women lifted the coffin to the scaffold, laid a fresh buffalo skin over it, and bound it down with thongs. The sky was leaden and stormy, and sleet began falling with the dusk. And at a word of command, the soldiers faced outward and discharged 3 volleys in succession. They and the Indians then marched back to the post. A squad of artillerymen remained beside the scaffold all night. And they built an honorary guard. And they built a large fire of pine wood and fired their howitzer every half hour until daybreak. It's just a symbol of respect. So far, you can see Maynadier is at least an honest-hearted character. He wanted something from them, but at the same time he granted them honors. And he learned things about them at the same time that he didn't know. So 4 days later, Red Cloud and a large party of Oglala appeared suddenly outside the fort. They stopped at Spotted Tail's camp, and the 2 Teton leaders were enjoying a reunion when Maynadier came out with a soldier escort to conduct both of them to his headquarters with the pomp and ceremony and drums and bugles. And when Maynadier told Red Cloud that the new peace commissioners would not arrive at the fort until Fort Laramie for some weeks, the Oglala chief became angry. Big Mouth and the other messengers had told him that if he came in and signed a treaty, he would receive presents. He needed guns, he needed powder, he needed provisions. Maynadier replied that he could issue the visiting Oglala's provisions from the army stores, but he had no authority to distribute guns and powder. And so Red Cloud then wanted to know what the treaty would give his people. They had signed treaties before, and it always seemed that the Indians gave to the white men. This time the white men must give something to the Indians. This is Red Cloud's insistence now. Now, remembering that the president of the new commission, E.B. Taylor, was in Omaha, Maynadier suggested that Red Cloud send a message to Taylor over the telegraph wires. Red Cloud was suspicious. He didn't entirely trust the magic of the talking wires. And after some delay, he agreed to go with the colonel to the fort's telegraph office, and through an interpreter dictated a message of peace and friendship to the Great Father Counselor in Omaha. Now, Commissioner Taylor's reply came clicking back. The Great Father at Washington wants you all to be his friends and the friends of the white man. If you conclude a treaty of peace, he wishes to make presents to you and your people as a token of his friendship. A train loaded with supplies and presents cannot reach Fort Laramie from the Missouri River before the 1st of June. Now, this is March, remember. And he desires that about that time be agreed upon as the day when his commissioners shall meet you as a treaty. And this transcript is, you can find it in Red Cloud and the Sioux Problem. It's Lincoln University of Nebraska Press. It's by James C. Olson. Red Cloud and the Sioux Problem. And so he's offered this back over the telegraph. Now, this is like the beginning of your modern technology. Nowadays, we'd say all the weeks and months that passed over all these ordeals, we'd pick up our cell phones today and make phone calls. Well, the telegraph wire, that was all the modern technology of the day. And so he sent his request, he got an answer back. Now, Red Cloud was pretty damn impressed by this. He also liked Colonel Maynadier's straightforward manner. He could wait until the moon when the grass was green. Or the green grass was up, The moon when the green grass was up. For the treaty signing. That's in the beginning of June. This would give him time to go back to the Powder and send out runners to all the scattered bands of the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. It would give the Indians time to gather more buffalo hides and beaver skins for trading when they came down to Fort Laramie in June. And so as a goodwill gesture, Maynadier issued small amounts of powder and lead to the departing Oglalas. He's giving them ammunition for their rifles to go hunting. And they rode away in a really good humor, Red Cloud and his band. And nothing had been said by Maynadier about opening the Bozeman Road. Nothing had been said by Red Cloud about Fort Reno, which was still under siege on the Powder. And these subjects could be postponed until the Treaty Council. So Red Cloud didn't wait for the green grass to come up. He returned to Fort Laramie in May, the moon when the ponies shed. And he brought with him his chief lieutenant, Man Afraid of His Horses. And more than 1,000 Oglala came with him. Dull Knife brought in several lodges of Cheyenne, and Red Leaf arrived with his band of Brûlés. Together with Spotted Tail's people and the other Brûlés, they formed a great camp along the Platte River. And the trading posts and the sutlers' stores became a swirl of activity. Never had Big Mouth and the Laramie loafers been so busy arranging trades. If you're a fan of MASH, remember the old series MASH? Big Mouth and these other Laramie loafers are kind of like Klinger was and Radar. They were always procurers of things. And so that's why I see them as kind of comical. Now, doesn't this feel a little uplifting to you? We're getting into Red Cloud's war. So you know something bad's coming. But in the meantime, this is like Happy. This is Maynadier, the commander of the fort. He'd struck a good position with Red Cloud and the other natives. And they were bringing them in. The commission was coming in June with a trainload of supplies for the Indians, gifts for them in exchange for them signing this treaty, to open up the Bozeman Trail, to relent on Fort Connor, to open up the railways and the telegraphs through Indian land. And now you see these 1,000 people coming in, joining Spotted Tail's band, and they're setting up shops. There's sutlers there. Sutlers were shop owners. And it's almost like a marketplace opens up. And they're all happy. And a few days later, the peace commissioners arrived. And on June 5th, the formal proceedings began. And with the usual long orations by commission members who were love to hear themselves speak, standing beneath this serene sky, the broad fields now reposing from the labors of the waning year, it is with a happy heart that I do present, blah, 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 blah. And so these long orations by the commission members and the various Indian leaders. Then Red Cloud unexpectedly asked for a few days' delay while they awaited the arrival of the other Tetons who wanted to participate in the discussions. Commissioner Taylor agreed to adjourn the council until June 13th. So by a trick of fate, June 13th was the day that Colonel Henry B. Carrington and 700 officers and men of the 18th Infantry Regiment reached the vicinity of Fort Laramie. The regiment had marched from Fort Kearney, Nebraska, and was under orders to establish a chain of forts along the Bozeman Road in preparation for the expected heavy travel to Montana during the summer months coming up. And although plans for the expedition had been underway for weeks, none of the Indians invited to attend the treaty signing had been told anything about this military occupation of the Powder River country. This isn't opening roads. This is establishing a trail of forts and a military presence. Now, to avoid friction with the 2,000 Indians camped around Fort Laramie, Carrington halted his regiment 4 miles east of the post. Standing Elk, one of the Brûlés chiefs who had come to the fort during the winter, watched from his distant teepee while the soldiers formed their wagon train into a hollow square. He then mounted his pony and rode over to the camp, and the soldier guards took him in to see Colonel Carrington. Now, Carrington summoned one of his guides to interpret, and after they'd gone through the formalities of pipe smoking, Standing Elk asked bluntly, "Where are you going?" Carrington replied frankly that he was taking his troops to the Powder River country to guard the road to Montana. "There is a treaty being made in Laramie with the Sioux that are in the country where you're going," Standing Elk told him. "You'll have to fight the Sioux warriors if you go there now." Carrington said he wasn't going to make war on the Sioux, but only to guard the road. They will not sell their hunting grounds to the white men for a road, Standing Elk insisted. And they won't give you the road unless you whip them. He added quickly that he was a Brule and that he and Spotted Tail were friends of the white men, but that Red Cloud's Oglalas and the Minneconjou would fight any white man who came north of the Platte River, especially before signing any treaty. So before the next day's treaty proceedings, the presence and purpose of the regiment of Bluecoats were known to every Indian at Fort Laramie. When Carrington rode into the fort the next morning, Commissioner Taylor decided to introduce him to the chiefs and quietly inform them of what they already knew, that the United States government intended to open a road through the Powder River country regardless of the treaty. Do you see what's happening here? The peace commissioners are there, the treaty commissioners are there to get permission, bring gifts, to sign treaties to open up the road. But now you've got Carrington and his troops are coming to guard the road which hasn't been signed for yet. You see what this is looking like now to the Native Americans? Wait, you're already bringing troops to guard a road that we haven't agreed to let you build yet? And so Carrington's first remarks were drowned out by a chorus of disapproving Indian voices. And when he resumed speaking, the Indians continued muttering amongst themselves, began moving restlessly on the pine-board benches where they were assembled on the fort parade ground, and Carrington's interpreter suggested in a whisper that perhaps he should allow the chiefs to speak first. So, man afraid of his horses, took the platform, and in a torrent of words, he made it clear that if the soldiers marched into Sioux country, his people were going to fight them. Don't march into our territory. And now, you see, the whole complexion is changing. They see the soldiers, and what do they think? They think attack. They think slaughter, massacre. He made it clear, if you march into Sioux territory, we're going to attack you. We'll fight you. And in 2 months, in 2 moons, the command will not have a hoof left, he declared. Now it was Red Cloud's turn. His lithe figure, clad in light blanket and moccasins, he moved to the center of the platform. His straight black hair was parted in the middle. It was draped over his shoulders to the waist. And his wide mouth was fixed in a determined slit between his hawk nose. His eyes flashed as he began scolding the peace commissioners for treating the Indians like children. He accused them of pretending. Imagine if this were the United States negotiating with, say, a European country, and they saw similar types of activity. Wait, we're going to sign a treaty with you, but you're already sending your troops to enforce the elements of the treaty we haven't agreed to yet. And imagine it's like the president standing up and saying, this is the way it's going to be. Here's the line in the sand. And he may not have quite had that attitude if the troops weren't already there to enforce what is not signed for yet. And so he accused them of pretending to negotiate for a country while they prepared to actually take it by conquest. He was pissed off, Red Cloud. The white men have crowded the Indians back year by year, he said, until we're forced to live in a small country north of the Platte River, and now our last hunting ground, the home of the people, is to be taken from us. Our women and children will starve. But for my part, I prefer to die fighting rather than by starvation. Now, maybe you might think he's being provocative here, that he's provoking, he's poking the bear. But remember, he's pissed off. Not just pissed off. That makes it sound like a barroom brawl. He's deeply angered by this. Why? Because he's seen what's been happening to his people for decades. And so he said, our women and children will starve, But for my part, I preferred to die fighting rather than by starvation. Great Father sends us presents and wants a new road. But White Chief goes with soldiers to steal the road before any Indian says yes or no. So while the interpreter was still trying to translate the Sioux words into English, the listening Indians became so disorderly that Commissioner Taylor abruptly ended the day's session. Red Cloud strode past Carrington as if he weren't even in the room. They weren't in a room, they were outside. He strode right past him as if he ignored him. Head in the air. And he continued on across the parade ground toward the Oglala camp, and before the next dawn the Oglala were gone from Fort Laramie. During the next few weeks, as Carrington's wagon train... This is kind of like, whether you like him or not, it's kind of like Trump walking out of some of the negotiations he's had with Korea. This was like Reagan walking out on Gorbachev at Reykjavik back in the 80s. He's walked out and they went home. So Carrington's wagon train moved north along the Bozeman Road. The Indians had an opportunity to appraise its size and its strength, and 200 wagons were loaded to the bows with mowing machines, shingle and brick machines, wooden doors, windows, sashes, locks, nails, musical instruments for a 25-piece band, rocking chairs, churns, canned goods, vegetable seeds, as well as the usual ammunition, gunpowder, and other military supplies. And the Bluecoats evidently expected to stay in the Powder River country. A number of them had brought their wives and their children along with an assortment of pets and servants. And they were armed with obsolete muzzle loaders and a few breech-loading Spencer carbines, and were supported by 4 pieces of artillery. For guides, they had secured the services of Blanket Jim Bridger and Medicine Calf Beckworth, who knew that Indians were watching the daily progress of the train along the Powder River Road. By June 28th, the regiment reached Fort Reno. And we got to stop there tonight. Tomorrow we're going to get into the thick of what happened with Red Cloud and the U.S. military. Thanks for being here tonight, folks. We'll be back in 23 hours after this long break. So I want you to sit tight. Have a good night. See you tomorrow. Read up on this stuff, by the way. Look it up. Look up Red Cloud. Look up Red Cloud's War. Look up this whole era of history. It's interesting stuff, and it's well worth knowing because it's stuff we weren't taught. Thanks for being here. Have a good night.